For days now, there has been talk about an Israeli ground offensive, and now that it's underway, when and how long will the fighting end or last? I'm joined now by Kate Gould, a lobbyist with a pacifist organization called the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Matthew Brodsky, a Middle East analyst and former director of policy at the Jewish Policy Center here in Washington. Welcome back to the show, both of you. Kate, you were just here 24 hours ago. You said a ground incursion would make brokering a ceasefire nearly impossible. Here we are now. So what do you make of it?
Israel's ground invasion certainly makes things far more difficult, but we have to redouble efforts to try to get a ceasefire agreement. There will eventually be a ceasefire agreement. The question is how many lives are lost, how much destruction is wrought before that happens.
Matt?
Well, I think Israel has specific goals now. Yes, a ceasefire will eventually happen, but Israeli goals seem to be now not just creating some quiet, but also destroying the tunnels and the infrastructure underneath for which Hamas has been sending out people into Israel, such as earlier today, right before the ceasefire, to try to kidnap Israeli soldiers. So it seems like the goal has changed. So while there are Israeli soldiers on the ground, I think that they want to take care of that as much as they can before a ceasefire happens.
Do you think Egypt will be the main player here? That has been attempted. You heard Jessica talk about their new leader. What will it take to de-escalate the situation at this point? Or do you think Israel will get what it needs to done and then we'll see some talking later?
The ground invasion will yield no progress. It'll only mean more bloodshed. And Egypt's role is certainly important here. We also need Turkey's role. As your reporter from Tel Aviv mentioned, I mean, the relationship between Turkey and Hamas is very important in all this. But what's critical to note about Egypt's proposal for a ceasefire was that was negotiated with Israel and not with the Hamas leadership. And so for a ceasefire agreement to actually take hold and to work and to stop this killing, then it has to be negotiated with both Israel and Hamas.
Matt, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that that's realistic? That
Egypt can create the ceasefire and be the mediator? I think they're going to have to be. I don't think it's helpful from an American perspective to have too much of the Qataris and too much of the Turkey people, their government involved. They're inherently hostile to Israel to begin with and supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas by extension. So to the extent that they're involved, I would say it should be to make sure that Hamas doesn't fire rockets, because the ceasefire in the end is going to happen, but it's after Israel, I believe, accomplishes what it's trying to do, and that's, again, tunnels and to destroy stockpiles of rockets where they can find them, because the status quo of just firing rockets at civilians in Israel and then Israel having to respond as any country would, that is something they would like to avoid.
I want to ask your opinion on this, both of you. You know, this escalation started with 4 deaths, 3 Israeli teenagers, 1 Palestinian teenager. Now we have many, many more as a result of that. How long can this last? How many more deaths? I mean, a lot of watchers will say, par for the course, this has happened before, this happens every few years. Could they look back to the 2012 ceasefire and use that as a blueprint to end this?
Definitely. The 2012 ceasefire can certainly serve as a framework going forward. In fact, in July 4th, there was Hamas officials that actually proposed a restoration of the 2012 ceasefire agreement. And what's critical about that agreement, and so different from Egypt's latest proposal, is that requires Israel to make progress toward lifting the blockade. And that's just a critical part. You mentioned these killings of Israeli teenagers, the burning alive of a Palestinian teenager. I mean, all of this horrific violence is obviously something to be condemned. And but an important point to understand the broader context here is that there is this blockade, this 7-year blockade of Gaza that has imposed so much poverty on the Gaza Strip, meaning that people just can't trade, they can't access education, they can't leave the Gaza Strip, so they can't, including Palestinian Americans who are there right now and trapped in the violence, they can't leave. So there has to be a lifting of the blockade in order to really end this violence. And that was, Israel committed to that in the 2012 ceasefire agreement, and that needs to be restored in order to move forward.
Matt gets the last word.
She mentions the 7-year blockade. We should remember that it was 9 years ago that Israel pulled out all of their settlers, all of their military from Gaza, turned it over to the Palestinian Authority. There was no blockade then. The blockade exists to prevent Hamas from acquiring rockets, which is what they're producing. The cement that they use to build the tunnels that they're doing, this is what they're choosing to do instead of building roads or anything that's really helpful for their own people. So the blockade exists for a reason, and what we've seen now is even more sophisticated missiles, more sophisticated rockets. I don't think the blockade, lifting that is the answer. I think the answer is Hamas should not be in power in Gaza.
All right, Matt Brodsky, Kate Gould, we appreciate you both. We'll have to save the military part for another conversation. Thank you so much.